Well, I know in the book you talk about the inscriptions on the Jefferson Memorial, which most Americans know or have some familiarity with. Of course, that's hearkening back to a God in a Christian tradition and a Western tradition. Of course, Jefferson himself was a champion of separation of church and state. And they understood these moral principles that came out of our religious tradition really were undergirding our political system. Isn't there a distinction between, and I know you showed it to a gentleman in Iran,
yeah.
a professor at the University of Tehran who's
a leading a reformer, who father of the reform movement in Iran, Abdul Karim Saroush.
And he tried to draw a connection between Jefferson's expression of the godly foundation of the American Revolution and the Iranian experience. But do you really think that's valid, given the vast differences between the Judeo-Christian tradition of the West and the Shiite Muslim tradition of Iran?
Oh, what strikes me most of all is that today in Iran, and through much of the Islamic world, Turkey, we're seeing it play out in politics as well, there is a big debate about the same issue. What is the relationship between a faith that is part of a culture and the state? And in Iran, they merged the two, and it has been a colossal failure. People throughout the region, as they debate this subject, are looking for ways to be good Muslims, but also to live in modern states with freedoms. Now, they don't want all the same kinds of freedoms we do, because Islam has prohibitions on alcohol, for example. Muslims are very sensitive about the issue of pornography, and so the idea of a totally free press scares them. There are likely to be greater restrictions. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to basics like free speech and freedom to worship as you please, the freedom to elect your leaders and to see them turn over power to somebody else who's freely elected, are very important principles that are now being under debate. This is the whole purpose of the book is to say the same kind of phenomena we went through in the West is with the Reformation within Christianity, which gave birth to the Enlightenment and in turn modern democracy, has begun in the Islamic world. But they're trying to do everything at the same time. They're trying to go through a reformation and a political overhaul all at once.
You believe you see signs of Islam itself organically changing in the Middle East?
Well, look, there is no one Islam. The theocrats try to say there's only one path and only one set of values, but the diversity of views. Look within Christianity. Within most faiths, there are multiple trends, and there are even, you could argue, a greater array of trends within the Islamic world, which accounts for 1 out of every 5 human beings on earth. It's the world's largest religion, and it stretches from Morocco to Indonesia.
Lech Walesa, who helped bring freedom to Poland, was a Roman Catholic who led a passive resistance movement. He didn't lead an army. He didn't order anybody to commit a suicide attack. Yet he brought down one of the most brutal regimes in the history of the planet. Who do you see as the Lech Walesas in the Middle East? Who are they?
There's not a trade union leader that's comparable. Let's take Nelson Mandela, someone again. But remember, Nelson Mandela went to prison because he'd been involved in planning a bomb. I mean, some of our heroes engaged in violence as well.
Lech Walesa did not do that.
No, but I'm just saying some of the people who've won a Nobel Peace Prize engaged initially in violence. This is not a phenomena that's limited to the Islamic world. But in the case of one of my favorite characters in the book is a man named Riyad Turk, who's the Nelson Mandela of Syria. Here's a man who's gone to prison over and over and over. And the third time he was in jail, he was held in a room the size of an elevator with no bed, no toilet, no furniture, no window. He had no contact with anyone, no lawyer, no trial. He had no sense of how long he was going to be held. No communication with his family or his 2 little girls. He was protesting the autocratic rule of President Assad. And he had nothing to do every day, so he kept from going insane by taking the uncooked kernels of rice from his soup at night and building geometric designs on the floor of his cell. And he did that for 18 years. And what did he do when he came out at the age of 68, his 3rd incarceration? He started protesting again. And what happened to him? He went back to jail again. And there are incredibly inspiring people we don't pay enough attention to who are challenging the most autocratic leaders left in the world.
When you describe Sheikh Nasrallah, you describe him as a very charismatic person who obviously has a tremendous popular following in Lebanon, even to the point where after the most recent war with Israel, his popularity and admiration extended outside the Shia community in Lebanon. Riyad Turk, on the other hand, does he have a popular following in Syria at all?
Oh, I think he does. I think he's one of a number of activists. He's not a lone figure. There are a cross-section of them who are engaging in challenges. They've issued the Damascus Declaration to challenge the regime. They've tried to mobilize all the opposition groups so they act as one with a set of common principles. They've called for not just a change in regime behavior, but a change in the regime itself. Very brave steps if you happen to live in that country.
Sure. But his background, he's a Marxist, correct?
He's a former Marxist, what I call the neo-Marxist. And one of the great ironies of the region, we, the United States and others in the West, encouraged the Islamic movements originally in the 1970s to be a counterweight to the Marxist movements, because we were so afraid that the Soviet Union its tentacles would sweep into the region and convert these into Marxist states. The irony is that today, many of those who are most democratic are the former Marxists who are acting, trying to form democracy movements, issuing democratic declarations, have turned against the Soviet Union, have redefined what they hope to achieve, and have become ones that work very closely with the liberals, the nationalists, and an assortment of other groups.
But they don't seem to get the sort of political traction that Hamas has, or that Hezbollah has, or even that the Iranian Revolutionary has, or the Shiite revolutionary parties in Iraq. They don't seem to have that hold on the people.
But you're equating a lot of different kinds of Islamic movements.
Sure.
Remember that to be a Muslim, a devout Muslim, does not mean you are an extremist.
Sure.
And that there are extraordinary number of people who women who wear the scarf and men who wear beards and who go to mosque and who want the same things that we do in the United States. It's a tiny fraction of people who engage in extremists. And the Islamist party you talk about in Iraq is part of the government coalition. It's very different from Hezbollah or Hamas.
Although they support Hezbollah, do they not?
No.
Dawa does not?
Oh, well, you're talking about Dawa. I thought you were talking about the Iraqi Islamist Party, but Islamic Party. Dawa had connections before it. Now there are two Dawas, and one has better relations with Iran and Hezbollah than the other.
I mean, an irony I think you point out in your book is it was the Dawa terrorists in Kuwait who inspired the Hezbollah terrorist action in Lebanon. Is that not true? No? How does that work?
The first sites that were targeted by Muslim extremists were in Lebanon, and it wasn't until there had been many of them when there was the attack in Kuwait.
And then later the aim of some of the attacks or the hijackings and so forth was to liberate the Dawa terrorists who had been held in Kuwait.
Yes.
That's true.
Well, because they included some Lebanese.
And now that party, the Dawa party, is in fact the party of Nouri al-Maliki, the Prime Minister of Iraq.
As I said, the Dawa has split, and it's also evolved significantly, renouncing violence.
Sure. Let me ask you about Egypt. Egypt is a country that, in the last few decades, has basically been a friend of the United States. They've made peace with Israel. They've maintained peace with Israel. When push comes to shove, and there's a conflict that involves U.S. interests in the Middle East, Egypt has either not stood in our way or has basically been friendly to us. Should the United States want to see a fundamental change in the government of Egypt? Should we want to see the emergence of some force that overthrows Mubarak or whatever would follow on Mubarak if Egypt kept on its same political course?
If you want stability in the Middle East, if you want to bring peace to the Middle East, you want to see governments give their citizens the kinds of rights that we believe in. And very few of those are practiced in Egypt. The president, under pressure from the United States, allowed for the first time real opposition when he ran for president a couple of years ago. And what did he do immediately after the election, which he won overwhelmingly? He imprisoned his lead opponent, who is still in jail. These are not, the United States condemns the holding of this man. And, you know, the danger for us is that down the road we see more violent reaction to governments because people feel that they have no alternative, that the use of the ballot is prohibitive. Or, I mean, you know, in Egypt when you go to vote, the government buses in its supporters early in the day and then afterwards harasses people and slows the voting process, doesn't, especially in opposition areas. They are not free and fair elections in Egypt.
I understand, but do you think we'd have more violent opposition than Hezbollah is in Lebanon or Hamas is in the Palestinian Authority or than the Iranian revolutionaries were? That if that's going to be the case down the road, you believe?
But you're making the case that we should allow some of the world's most autocratic governments to not to face U.S. pressure to open up because simply because there's greater stability for us.
Well, you say if you want stability in the Middle East, you want to see the rights emerge that we have here. But haven't we had stability in Egypt? I mean, Mubarak has been president since Sadat was assassinated.
Do you believe autocracy can bring stability?
Well, I'm not asking about...
Ferdinand Marcos did in the Philippines.
Fact,
he had stability. Was that fair to the average Filipino?
I think you wrote in your book that Iran had a dynasty for 2,500 years before the Ayatollah came to power.
It wasn't one dynasty, it was many dynasties.
I'm not asking, Robin, what's good for the people of Egypt or what eventually might optimize freedom in Egypt. I'm asking what's in the interests of the United States of America and the American people. In other words, if in fact, you are very critical of the war in Iraq at the end of your book and saying that by invading there we've unleashed some forces that have basically been regressive, not progressive, despite the fact they've had elections. Is it not possible that by unleashing these forces in the Middle East, as we've seen with Hamas, as we've seen with Hezbollah, as we've seen with some of the parties or the Mahdi army in Iraq, that we are sending ourselves on a path where we will create greater risk of terrorism into the security of the American people than less?
I do believe that the invasion of Iraq was probably the greatest foreign policy mistake the United States has ever made, and that we will pay for it for a long time to come. I am delighted that the Iraqi Sunnis have engaged in an awakening, which they came to of their own conclusion, was not something we sponsored, even thought of. We recognized as it was happening, we tapped into it to help them. But the fact is, it was because of their own reaction against al-Qaeda, an acknowledgement that they were living under worse conditions and that they reacted against it and were willing to take on al-Qaeda. That's the kind of important thing that I've begun to see happen elsewhere, a reaction against the extremism, that people don't want more violence, that the majority of people are looking for peaceful means for a political change to challenge the status quo and to challenge the extremists.